The Greatest Generation, 1901 to 1927. Picture this, you're 10 years old. You come home from school and your father is sitting at the kitchen table, head in his hands. Not because he lost his job, because he lost everything: the savings, the house, the belief that tomorrow would be better than today. That was the Great Depression. And for the greatest generation, it wasn't a paragraph in a textbook. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or the lack of it. You learned to stretch a single chicken across 3 days. You wore shoes until your toes curled against the front because new ones weren't an option. You stopped asking for more because you saw what more cost the people you loved. And then, just as you reached adulthood, the world came calling, not with opportunity, with a draft notice. 18-year-olds stormed Omaha Beach while machine gun fire tore through their brothers. 19-year-olds flew bombing runs over Germany, knowing each mission might be their last. The ones who stayed home, they rationed sugar, grew victory gardens, and worked factory lines until their hands bled. Here's what extreme adversity does to people. It doesn't break them, it rebuilds them stronger. But this generation didn't philosophize about resilience. They didn't journal about their trauma or talk about their feelings. Not because they didn't have them, but because feelings were a luxury they couldn't afford. You didn't process trauma, you buried it and kept moving. Because there was a war to win, a family to feed, and self-pity didn't rebuild anything. Psychologists now call this stoic pragmatism, the bone-deep belief that hardship is inevitable, complaining is pointless, and the only thing that matters is what you do next. And that mindset gave them a superpower, an almost supernatural ability to endure. They could sit with uncertainty without spiraling. They could lose everything and start over the next morning. They didn't need the world to be fair. They just needed a clear task and the grit to finish it. They carried that into the factories and boardrooms of post-war America. They carried it into their marriages. And whether they knew it or not, they passed it down, in smaller, diluted doses, to every generation that followed. The silent generation, when silence meant survival. You were born into a world already on fire. The Depression carved itself into your earliest memories. Your mother boiling the same bones twice to stretch a pot of soup. Your father leaving before sunrise and returning empty-handed, eyes hollow. And if you lived in Oklahoma, Texas, or Kansas, you remember something even worse: the sky turning black at noon. Dust storms so thick your mother had to tie wet rags over your baby sister's face, just so she could breathe. Families loading everything they owned into trucks and heading west on Route 66, only to be turned away at gunpoint at the California border. You learned that silence was safer than questions, because the adults around you didn't have answers either. Then the war came. You watched the men leave, brothers, cousins, neighbors. Some came back different. Some didn't come back at all. You sat by the radio, listening to reports from places you couldn't find on a map, learning that the world was bigger and more dangerous than anyone had prepared you for. By the time peace arrived, you'd already learned the most important lesson: keep your head down. Because those who spoke up, stood out, or questioned authority, you saw what happened to them. Then came McCarthy and the Red Scare. It didn't just target communists. It targeted anyone who looked different, thought different, or attended the wrong meeting 10 years ago. Teachers fired for books on their shelves. Actors blacklisted for friendships. Neighbors turning on neighbors. You learned that even in peacetime, the wrong word could destroy your entire life. So you stayed quiet, not because you lacked courage, but because you'd seen the cost of speaking up. This is why the silent generation followed the rules, not from lack of imagination, but from an abundance of caution earned through experience. They took the secure job, married young, stayed put, built lives on stability, not self-expression. And while other generations raised their voices, they were the ones who kept the world turning. Baby boomers, born into victory, baptized in betrayal. You arrived into a world that seemed unstoppable. 76 million American born into the boom. The war was over, the economy was exploding. New highways, new suburbs, new televisions in every living room. For the first time in decades, the future looked like something to run toward. But underneath all that optimism lurked a terrifying shadow. You practiced duck and cover drills under your school desk, as if a wooden table could save you from a nuclear blast. You watched your parents' faces tighten during the Cuban Missile Crisis, their fear so thick you could taste it. You learned that the world could end in a flash, and there was nothing you could do about it except keep living. Then the cracks started showing. You watched Walter Cronkite's voice break announcing JFK was dead. 4 years later, Martin Luther King. 2 months after that, Bobby Kennedy. 3 assassinations in 5 years. Meanwhile, boys as young as 18 were getting drafted into a war that made no sense. Vietnam wasn't like World War II. There was no clear enemy, no front lines, no victory. Just jungles, guerrilla fighters, and a government that kept promising, "We're winning," while the body count climbed every night on the evening news. It was the first war Americans watched from their living rooms. And what you saw didn't match what you were being told. That kind of betrayal rewires you. It changes how you see authority forever. But here's the contradiction. The same generation that protested the system eventually ran asterisk it. The hippies became CEOs. The radicals became senators. The kids who marched for civil rights grew up to build the most consumer-driven economy in human history. Boomers became experts at reinvention, at pivoting when the world shifted. It's why they're still working, still leading, still refusing to step aside. They've been adapting their whole lives, and they're not stopping now. Generation Jones, forgotten middle. If you were born in the late 50s or early 60s, you probably don't recognize yourself in the boomer story. You didn't march on Washington. You didn't go to Woodstock. You were 8, maybe 10 years old, watching it on TV. Too young to join, but old enough to believe it meant something. You came home from school to Brady Bunch optimism. Your older siblings told you the world was changing, that anything was possible. Then reality hit. You were a teenager when Nixon resigned. You watched a president lie about Watergate for 2 years, get caught on tape, and quit before they could throw him out. Watergate wasn't just a scandal. It was the moment you learned the people in charge couldn't always be trusted. Your older siblings had their war to protest, but by the time you were draft age, Vietnam was over. The cause that defined their generation wasn't yours to fight. Instead, you turned 18 just in time to sit in gas lines that stretched for blocks, the result of an oil embargo that brought America to its knees. You heard words like stagflation on the news, prices climbing, jobs vanishing. By the time you were ready to buy your first home, mortgage rates hit 18%. The older boomers had already bought houses, started careers, locked in pensions. You got to watch from the outside, wondering what happened to the life you were promised. That's why they call you Generation Jones. The generation that spent its whole life jonesing for something just out of reach. You had all the hope of the generation before you, but none of the timing. So you stopped waiting. You took what was available, made it work, and learned not to count on promises. You became the bridge, not boomer, not Gen X, the ones who fell through the cracks and built a life there anyway. Are you Gen Jones? Share your story in the comments. I guarantee thousands of people will relate. Generation X, 1965-1980, the latchkey kids who raised themselves. You came home from school, and the house was empty. No one texted to check on you. No one tracked your location. You let yourself in with the key around your neck, made a snack, and figured out the rest on your own. Maybe you watched TV. Maybe you rode your bike until the streetlights came on. Maybe you got into trouble and learned how to get yourself out of it. That was just childhood. Your parents were at work, which meant you were on your own. And that wired something into you early. You had to solve your own problems because there was no one else around to solve them for you. This gave your generation something kids today will never understand. True freedom. No GPS, no notifications, no one monitoring where you were or when you'd be back. You left the house on Saturday morning and came home when the streetlights flickered on. And in between, you were a ghost. You built forts in the woods. You biked to the next town just to see what was there. You played until your legs hurt and drank from the garden hose because going inside meant the day was over. And if you made a mistake at 16, it stayed at 16. No camera in every pocket, no screenshot, no permanent record of every dumb thing you said or did. You got to be young and stupid in private, and that gave you room to figure out who you were without the whole world watching. But it wasn't all long summers and freedom. You saw things too. You watched your parents get hit hard by the early 80s recession, the stock market crash of '87, the layoffs and corporate downsizing that followed. You watched them sit at the kitchen table, voices low, bills spread out. You didn't understand all of it, but you understood enough. By the time you entered the workforce in the early '90s, another recession was waiting. You learned early that loyalty to a company didn't mean the company would be loyal back. The job for life your parents believed in, already dying, and you knew it. This didn't make Gen X lazy, it made them clear-eyed. You worked hard, but you didn't confuse hard work with job security. You didn't expect a gold watch or a pension. You expected to earn your place every single day, because you'd seen what happened to people who assumed they were safe. You kept your skills sharp and your resume ready, not because you didn't care, but because you'd learned the hard way. No one was going to look out for you but you. Some people call it cynicism. For Gen X, it's just reality. So here's the real question. Which generation are you, and how has their story shaped yours? Because whether you realize it or not, you carry their scars, their resilience, their lessons. The way you handle money, relationships, work, failure, it all traces back to people who lived through things you've only read about. If this video made you see yourself differently, do 3 things. 1. Hit subscribe ***, because we're diving deeper into how these generational patterns still control your life today. 2. Drop a comment telling me which generation you are and whether this story resonated. 3. Share this with someone from a different generation, because understanding where we came from is the first step to deciding where we're going. The generations that came before us didn't just survive, they built the world we're living in right now. The question is, what are we going to build next? See you in the next one.